Okay, so this is the second part of the skeletal system at level 2, and we're looking at the types of bone. So specifically we'll be looking at locating and naming different types of bone and identifying the structure of what we call a long bone, how that relates to the functions of a bone. So just before, if you go through the bones you learned before and try and think what they might be, so what classification might they be? Might they be long or short or flat or irregular? Just from the names you might be able to guess quite a few. So you might want to just pause this now, have a look at a picture of a skeleton or a skeleton if you've got one, and have a guess at which bones might be called long, short, flat or irregular. So just to recap then, so I don't know how you did, how did you do? So types you could have had is long bones like the femur, and when you have a long bone it's high but it's not deep or wide. When you've got an irregular bone, such as a vertebra, it's got different elements. So this bit relates to more like a short bone, but these bits are more like long bones. Doesn't really go in any category, therefore we call it irregular. Short bones, what you find with a short bone is that they are as high as they are wide as they are deep, like a dice or a Maltese or something like that. So you tend to get them in the wrists, the carpal bones, or the ankles, the tarsal bones. Flat bones tend to be flat, so what that actually means is they're quite high and wide but not very deep. So the scapula is a good example, as is the ilium, your rib cage, your sternum, are all examples of flat bones, and they tend to be protecting. Lastly, we've got sesamoid bones, which are seed-like literally, and the main one you need to know is the patella, which guides and helps the the rectus femoris to track. So before we go on to the long bone, go through your skeleton again and make sure you can put all of the bones you know into one of those categories. They do come up in the exams, so it's good to know. Once you've done that, we're going to crack on and look at the structure of a long bone. So these are very common in the body. This one here is a femur, but also things like your humerus, your tibia, your fibula, your phalanges. You've got a lot of long bones in the body, and their structure is quite interesting, and it allows us to relate to a lot of the functions of a bone. So first things to think about is we can divide it into the ends and the middle of the bone. So the ends are called epiphyses. So we've got a proximal epiphysis here, and we've got a distal epiphysis here. And the middle of the bone we call the diaphysis, or the shaft of the bone there. If I just go through some of the features of each of the sections. So if we look up here in the epiphysis, you can see the bone is mostly a spongy type. We call that a cancellous bone or spongy bone. Here it is here. Whereas the bone in the diaphysis is what we call compact bone, so it's arranged in rods down the sides. Okay, so you've got compact bone here and you've got cancellous bone here. The cancellous bone has lots of little holes in between it in the sponges, and in there lives something called red bone marrow. So red bone marrow, we get red bone marrow in the spaces in the spongy bone. The compact bone doesn't have any spaces in, but what it does have is one big space in the middle. You can see it here, and that's called the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity, which just means hole in the middle. In that medullary cavity lives another type of marrow, which we call yellow marrow. So if I put that in here, got yellow marrow here in the diaphysis, and we've got red bone marrow here in the spaces between the spongy bone. Okay. Right around the outside of the bone, I'm going to draw that in this blue colour. So we've got a layer that goes right around the outside of the bone. Excuse my drawing. And that is called the periosteum. The periosteum. So you'll see that comes up later. Periosteum has a lot of the bone building cells, which we call osteoblasts, and that helps the bone to stay strong over time. It causes a layer in the bone. A couple of other things, last thing really, or a couple of other things. One is You can see there's some lines here, and what that is, there's we leave some of the bone still cartilage for quite a long time until your bone is fully functioned. That enables the shaft of the bone to grow longer. So they are known as epiphyseal plates or epiphyseal growth plates, or sometimes just growth plates. So they help the bone to carry on getting longer. If we didn't have them, that wouldn't be able to happen. And in the case of the femur, your femur increases in length 3 to 5 times since your birth, and the growth plates are very important in that. If you're looking at exercising with youngsters, be aware of the growth plates because they can be vulnerable for some time. Last thing to look at is on the ends of the bone. You see we've got a covering there, okay, and that is known as hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. What that does is it stops the bone rubbing on the next bone, so it's very, very slippery stuff and helps the bone to wear away. So one last time, the ends of the bones are called the epiphyses. The middle part of the bone is called, the middle part of the bone is called the diaphysis. The epiphyses are made of spongy bone. The diaphysis is made of compact bone. The cancellous bone has lots of small spaces in where you have red bone marrow, and the compact bone has one large space called the medullary cavity where you find yellow bone marrow. The whole bone is covered by the periosteum. You have epiphyseal plates which help it to grow, and hyaline cartilage on the ends of the bones to help it articulate. So it's quite a clever structure. So a couple of questions for you. What type of tissue is the epiphyses made of? What's the role of articular cartilage or hyaline cartilage? It's the same thing. And what's the role of the epiphyseal plate? So just pause it there, make sure you can answer those questions, and you can move on. So I don't know if now you can do these things. You should better name 3 functions of the skeleton from before. Name 1 bone from the arm, the leg and the torso. 4 bones in the axial skeleton related to the types of bone. So if you want to go further, read the relevant pages in your chapter in your manual. Look on Kahoot for relevant quizzes. Have a look at the structure of a long bone worksheet, which you can download here, and complete the relevant section of your end of day learning checks. Next session we'll look at bone formation. So I mentioned it briefly, osteoblasts, and we'll look at a process called ossification.